Ladies and gentlemen, my name's Paul. Hopefully you're having an amazing day. Apologies for not being on camera for today, but I'm finishing a variable rate shading video which should be on the channel the next day or two, and that will focus on VRS for the Microsoft ecosystem, specifically Microsoft's work on Gears 5 and its impressive performance benefits for the Xbox Series X and also PC. So if you're interested, then of course subscribe if you're not already. With that said, let's begin by taking a look at the RX 6700 XT, specifically a filing which has been made by Gigabyte for the Euro-Asian Economic Commission. This filing does indeed confirm we are looking at 12 gigabytes of VRAM for this GPU, which is not new information. I leaked this, of course, last year anyway, but it is nice to see it officially confirmed. So the RX 6700 XT, as a quick reminder, has 40 compute units, 12 gigabytes of VRAM, that's on a 192-bit bus, and AMD have said that it's going to launch, well, basically the first half of the year. It's looking like it's going to be March or April, that's what I'm hearing. But of course, these things could possibly be delayed. Performance targets, as I've already mentioned a couple of times with some exclusives, it's going to be faster than the RTX 3060 Ti, but the RX 6700 is going to be a bit slower. It's going to be still faster than the RTX 3060, mind you. Of course, this is with traditional rasterization performance, not with ray tracing. The 6700 vanilla, I believe, has 36 compute units. From AMD, we're going to skip down the street to Sony, specifically regarding the losses that Sony are making per console, but the impressive sales figures. Sony have confirmed that they've shipped 4.5 million PlayStation 5 units worldwide in 2020, which obviously does not therefore account for the consoles that have been sold this year. That's really impressive, at least in my opinion, although of course the demand for PS4 has dropped quite dramatically. They've only sold 1.4 million units for the PS4, which is a 77% decrease, and this is from the October to December period. But again, that's not particularly a revelation. It's, well, really, you don't say. Sony says that there's actually a loss per PlayStation 5 sold in terms of the hardware. This is due to, and I'm going to read this verbatim, a strategic price point for PS5 hardware that were set lower than manufacturing costs. End quote. There's nothing actually said about the cost of the PS5's manufacturing, so we don't know exactly how much the hardware did cost to produce, but we can probably guess that it is over around the $450 mark, which would be what they would need to be selling it at when you account for other things like shipping costs and the cut from retailers. But you have to take into consideration that this is very normal, of course, for console manufacturing. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised if we heard much the same thing for the Xbox Series X as well. And obviously the benefit of console hardware is that it does become cheaper over time to produce. The only thing that could be worrying for Sony and Microsoft going forward, at least in the shorter term, is that the memory costs are actually going up, especially with things like GDDR6, and also SSD costs are not exactly the most stable thing in the world right now. However, this is something, of course, that's impacting everyone and is certainly not just relegated to Sony or Microsoft. Let's just be totally honest. At the end of the day, the Xbox Series X, the PlayStation 5, they are really good value for money in terms of the amount of performance and grunt that is part and parcel of their architecture. And obviously, even with the PC parts that are available today, like RTX 30 series, RDNA 2, Zen 3, you can't really build a system which is going to outperform PlayStation 5 or an Xbox Series X for about the same price. And this is even truer at the moment simply because of all of the pricing gouging and shortages of hardware in general. It's also worth noting that according to Daniel Ahmed, he believes that this is actually the best quarter in PlayStation history. And yeah, revenue has increased 40%. So Sony have raked in for the PlayStation division about $8.4 billion. Again, I want to stress this is just over this quarter, or rather the previous quarter. And now let's discuss the main reason that I'm actually making today's video. A number of you actually tagged me in this, so thanks to everyone who did, but it's to do with Control Ultimate Edition and the PlayStation 5 file size versus the Xbox Series X. Now, just in case you're unfamiliar with Control Ultimate Edition, these are obviously upgraded visuals for the next generation and have with them a host of improvements, including things like hardware-based ray tracing and faster frame rates. So the Series X and the PlayStation 5 both run at 30 FPS with ray tracing enabled, but if you disable ray tracing, it goes to 60 FPS, and that's at 1440p. And yeah, I honestly would advise you to check out Control. It's really good. It's on Game Pass on the Xbox and PC, I believe. So really, yeah, it's a really fun game. I actually recently completed it, and I'm currently going through the DLC. So it's definitely worth checking out. Anyway, getting to the point. So there's a report on, this started on psu.com, so I'll link it in the video description. I'm just using their report, although honestly, several other websites have picked up on this. And yeah, from my understanding, it originally stemmed from a Reddit post. So the game was 26 gigabytes. I'm going to round up and down the figures for all of our sanity. So it was around 26 gigs on the PlayStation 5 and 42.4 gigabytes on the Xbox Series X. And I actually had this double checked. I asked a couple of people on Twitter just to check this because I don't have my Series X at the moment linked up to a capture device. Because as I mentioned, I was working on the VRS thing. So because of that, I was kind of capturing a little bit of footage on my one of my PCs. But yeah, someone checked it and it was indeed that size. So there was obviously quite a disparity there. And the website is reporting, along with others, that this is because of Kraken, which is a compression technology for data. So I just want to make things really clear for just a second what Kraken is and the difference between lossless and, well, lossy compression. So lossy compression you can think of as, say, a JPEG. Let's just make things really easy. So if you save a JPEG, you can save it at different quality settings. This is independent of the resolution. And obviously, the higher the quality setting of the JPEG, the better the visual fidelity is. That is, more pixels, the better resolution, and it just looks a nicer image. Lossless compression, on the other hand, aims to compress data as much as possible, but you don't lose any data when you decompress it. So obviously, even with SSDs or whatever else, you want to compress data anyway, because for a start, people actually need to download the bloody game to, begin with. And B, even if you live in a magical fantasy world where internet connections are like 1 billion gigabytes per second, they still need to store it, and then you need to grab that from storage and then load it into main system memory. So with the previous generation, and I covered this much more extensively in another video, which was, I believe it's something like why SSDs are so important for next generation or something like that. I'll link it in the video description. But basically, the previous generation, so the PS4, the Xbox One, they had the worst of both worlds. So they had a really slow, weedy CPU, which meant that because they didn't have any dedicated decompression blocks, which the Xbox and PS5 do, you're basically trying to decompress data using the CPU. But again, as I just mentioned earlier, the CPU inside those consoles is weedy. It's based on the Jaguar architecture, which has a pretty low IPC and a low clock frequency. And combine both of those things together, it means that you don't really get the best performance. And of course, this is exacerbated because then you have to consider that those systems also had a slow mechanical drive. It was 5400 RPM. So not only do you have to deal with seek times in between, but even sequential reads were slow anyway. And so this is basically the worst of both worlds, where not only is the reading slow, but you can't compress the data that much anyway, which means that you can't even grab that much data. If you could highly compress the data, at least you could be pulling more out at a time. So it's basically the worst of both worlds. But Sony and Microsoft have basically employed compression technology for the PlayStation 5 and the Xbox Series systems. I'm not going to touch on the Xbox stuff here. Again, I've gone into this much more extensively in the SSD video, so I'm going to focus primarily on the PS5 here. So what they're basically saying is that the Kraken compression technology is the reason, at least this is the reason they're asserting, that the size of the PS5 install is so much smaller. And if you're unfamiliar with what Kraken is, Mark Cerny did a really good job of breaking this down at the Road to PS5 event, and you can actually see yourself that in the custom I/O unit slide, cache scrubbers, Kraken decompression, dedicated DMA controller, 2 I/O co-processors, on-chip RAM, and finally coherency engines. And obviously the Kraken decompression is, well, the dedicated decompression block on the SoC. So when you're actually reading from the SSD, you can obviously read uncompressed data, which would be, the worst case scenario, which is about 5.5 gigabytes per second, but you can actually compress it, and that hits around 8 to 9 gigabytes per second. However, sometimes some data can be compressed a lot more, and it could be up to about 22 gigabytes per second read. And this is just because some data does compress better than others. And there's also the fact that Sony have a license with Oodle Kraken and Oodle Texture. Those are available from Rad Game Tools, and basically any PlayStation developer who's creating for the PS5, they get to use those pieces of software for free. I've covered this much more extensively in the past, but I'm trying to bring everyone onto the same page. So the assertion here is that Kraken is the reason that the Xbox file size is so much larger than the PlayStation. But unfortunately, there's no actual evidence that this is the case. And there is a possibility that the PS5 compression is partly responsible, but remember the Xbox does have compression as well. Again, I've gone into this more extensively in the SSD video, but you can compress texture and other data with the Xbox anyway. In my opinion, it's more likely that, yes, compression probably does make a small difference, but I suspect that the Xbox Series systems have just basically had much of their data mirrored from the PC. In fact, if you look at the install size for the PC version of the game, you can see it's almost identical. This is from my own Control Ultimate Edition from Steam. You can see how close it is in approximation. And it could be, and these are some theories, I don't have any hard evidence at the moment because Remedy have not said anything on this topic. It could be because the Xbox Series S and the Xbox Series X are both inside the same package. It could be that they haven't removed some of the previous generation assets for the Xbox One version of the game, or a lot of other reasons, besides that. But obviously, the PlayStation 5 version is smaller, and, that's good in terms of the installation size on the SSD. Am I saying it's not Kraken? I'm saying that there's no evidence that it is Kraken, and I think that it's much more likely to be other assets that are the culprit here. With that said, of course, the compression technology in the PlayStation 5 as well as the Xbox is pretty damn awesome. And as I was mentioning in an exclusive actually quite a while ago about the PlayStation 5s, you know what? You can actually update to my understanding anyway, you can actually update the PS5 to have better compression algorithms down the line anyway, so you can actually compress data even more, assuming obviously you do have better algorithms, but that's kind of a topic for another video. So my personal opinion is that I think it's much more likely it's just duplicate data in the Xbox installation of the game, and until we actually hear from the developers, it's impossible to know either way. But yeah, anyway, I think that's just about it for this particular video. Hopefully you've enjoyed it. If you did, then of course the normal stuff, like, share, comment and subscribe, and I'll see you soon. Take care of yourselves. Bye for now.